With this video, we will discuss the great effect that the pawn structure has on the harmony of the pieces. Opening and closing lines, controlling or opening key squares. This is all the role of the pawns. And often it turns out that the pawns themselves need to be given away for various purposes. We'll also in this video touch once again on our subject from the beginning of the course of how deadly is the misevaluation of the position. Misevaluation of the position, especially overly optimistic evaluation, is what leads a very great player here astray and causes him to lose a famous game. This was the game Bobby Fischer against Wolfgang Ullmann from the Buenos Aires tournament of 1960. Fischer had the white pieces, and the opening has been a win-over variation of the French. White has achieved pretty much all of his goals. His doubled pawns, c-pawns, are not so relevant. His dark squared bishop, however, is very strong. Ullmann, however, was a great master of the French, and he has just transferred his knight to e7 with the intention of going to f5, driving White's bishop away and gaining some counterplay on the king side, where Black's hopes lay. Fischer first played very well here. To stop Black's plan, he used this tactical move, knight h4. With this move, he trades a pair of knights, and thus is able to keep his bishop on the b8 to h2 diagonal, where it will be a problem for the Black king. So if Black takes on h4, of course White takes on e7, and then wins the pawn and more on f6. Next move. So Black protected the knight with rook d to e8, and now White took on g6. And here Black took back with the h-pawn in order to gain the open h-file. If he took with a knight, there would be no knight f5 coming, and White would therefore be able to keep his bishop on d6 without even having to exchange the pawn. And then he could pursue initiative on the queen side various ways, such as rook f to b1. But Black played a better move, h takes g6, when at least he has an open line for his rook, which could potentially cause problems. And Fischer, of course, anticipated this and planned the next series of moves, deadening Black's play on the h-file, but it's still a potential problem, and ultimately it leads to problems for White. So next came e takes f6. This move allows White's bishop to retreat along the b8 to h2 diagonal in response to knight f5. Normally White wouldn't want to trade off this pawn, but in this position he sees that he's able to keep the lines open. G takes f6, and now h3. This prepares the retreat of the bishop safely to h2, where it can't be bothered. And now White is getting a very nice position because of the lines toward the Black king. Black played knight f5, bishop h2, and Black played g5. So far Fischer played the last series of moves extremely strongly, and now if he just played a simple move, rook f to e1, he has a very good position. The bishop is a very dangerous piece for Black. Black has no apparent counterplay, and eventually the Black king will become drafty. Black's still fighting, of course, but it's a difficult position for Black to play. He always has to watch for every kind of opening of the position. White can also build up slowly some pressure on the e-file in some cases. However, Fischer was a little bit in a hurry here, and he played a tempting move that, however, was a serious mistake, and it gave away his positional capital. He played the move f4, hoping to win the game right away. He wants to get the queen to the f4 square. This is absolutely natural, and many players would make the same mistake because Ullmann's response was not easy to foresee. Now if Black simply takes on f4, most likely Fischer was looking at lines like this, and then probably rook takes f4 is better than queen takes f4, which could be met by e5. But basically White then will build up with bishop g4, rook f1, and perhaps even at the right moment to capture with the rook on f5, allowing queen to f4. But black's under great pressure here on the f-file and on the b8 to h2 diagonal. Also, white intends to take on g5, opening up either the e5 square for the bishop to sit permanently or the queen to f4, and further pressure on the f-file, also bishop g4 coming. So I think that Fischer was very optimistic at this point, but Ullmann now found a very nice sequence of moves, which changed the nature of the game. The move f4 has one very serious disadvantage, is that it permanently weakens the e4 square. And Ullmann took advantage of this by knight to d6. Very strong maneuver. The knight intends to come right into e4, and with tempo as well. And then black might even take the pawn on c3. So it changes how things, how the whole panorama here. This little move aiming at this strong central outpost. Fischer, of course, most likely he saw this move, but intended to respond with bishop f3. But he didn't see the following very nice positional idea that black carried out. Of course, knight e4 is a very big threat. If white took on g5, this was worth considering. If he saw the danger that the move in the game posed. And then after knight e4, queen e3. And then black could probably take on c3. Queen takes c3, knight takes c3, bishop f3, f takes g5, a5, and play this kind of position, where white's down a pawn, but he has two bishops. Bishop will come to e5 very strongly, and then he can hope to invade on the f-file. But that's natural was to cover e4 with bishop f3. And still, black faces some of the same problems. Perhaps you could say even bigger problems. If g takes f4, queen takes f4, and now the knight is under attack, the pawn on f6 is under attack, and if the knight moves, then checkmate on b8. Also, white threatens just to take on g5 and open up an attack by the bishop against the knight on d6. Meanwhile, if knight e4, white will of course take the knight. After pawn takes, f takes g5, and then we compare in this opposite color bishop position the two bishops. White's striking through black's king's position, black's bishop totally blocked by his own pawns. And queen f4 is coming next. Also, white will invade with his rook on the f-file. So it's also a pretty bad position for black. However, black played a very nice idea to destroy the effect of white's pieces. This bishop is temporarily blockaded. I'm sure that Fischer never imagined that this bishop could become deadened. But Ullmann found a way. He played the move g4, giving up this pawn so that white won't be able to free his bishop. And then after h takes g4, if bishop takes g4, this would allow the knight into e4 with tempo, and then f5, and then follow up with queen takes c3, and white's position is terrible. And black has regained his pawn, and white's bishop, both bishops in fact, will be very bad, and the queenside pawns will be weak. So instead, white took with the h pawn, keeping control of e4, and now came f5. This is black's idea. He simply sacrificed a pawn to kill this bishop off, and now it no longer is striking along this diagonal. It's no longer working with the rest of the white pieces, and a new situation arises. So black is getting ready to probably take on g4 and then knight e4 with tempo. So naturally white played g5, making a passed pawn. G takes f5 would be no more effective. Black could take with the pawn, and this only helps black. Now the e-file is open for black, the knight is still coming to e4, and the kingside files are also open. So white played g5, and now black is down a pawn, but he has a kind of blockade position, and this bishop has no future. It's blocked on its current diagonal, but all of its other diagonals are also blocked. The c3 and d4 pawns are blocking it, and really has very little future for that bishop. it can only sit on g3 and be a defensive piece. Black will also play knight e4 and force the exchange of this light squared bishop at some point. So still white's not worse though. Black played rook e7, preparing to double his rooks, bringing it over to the h-file. Bishop g3, now bishop e8. Black prepares to bring the bishop over to, he thinks, has some ideas of bringing the bishop perhaps to h5. White played queen e3 with the idea of queen e5, and so here Ullman stopped that with a move knight e4. And white had no choice but to take this knight. The bishop on g3 is under attack, and the pawn on c3, a move like bishop e1 is too passive. Black would play rook e to h7 and threaten checkmate on h2, and the initiative would be too strong, would be real strong for black. Ultimately, white would have to take the knight anyway. So white took on e4, and black took back with a d-pawn. So now it's opposite colored bishops. White's up a pawn, but his bishop is ineffective. Black's bishop isn't that great either, but the position is of a blockade nature. And furthermore, white has a problem with this pawn on a4, and potentially there's this bishop from e8 can come to c6, and if this pawn on e3 can push forward, if white ever leaves the blockade, we'll see that it can become a very strong piece. Fischer, however, was very optimistic and thought that it's just better, and he logically has won a pawn and will eventually, after some difficulty of course, win the game. But in reality it's about equal position. It's pretty much drawish, but his overestimation of his position led him to ruin. So king f2 white played. Another possibility white should consider on the next couple of moves is the move d5. In an opposite colored bishop position, the number of pawns is not so important, but having free diagonals for the pieces is for the bishop, and free lines for the pieces and the initiative is more important. So this move was very much worth considering. After e takes d5, then perhaps queen d4, and then bishop f2, and white's queen is now suddenly in the game. But Fischer didn't want to give up this pawn and hoped to use the extra pawn. Still, after d5, white's not really better. Maybe has some practical chances, but it should still be about equal. White played king f2. With this move, he hopes to oppose the h-file with rook h1, but he also has another idea. Black played rook e to h7. So he puts his rook on the h-file, stopping white from controlling the file with rook h1. Again, white could consider d5. Meeting e takes d5 with queen d4, again with somewhere around equal position. Perhaps white creates some more problems for black that way. But Fischer played rook f to b1. And now black played queen to d5. So he blocked this pawn and prevented white ever from pushing d5. This was very important, and maybe black should have even played it the move before. So here white's now played queen e1. This was a serious mistake. This is the symptom of Fischer's overestimation of his position. It's actually an enterprising idea. He wants to put his king on e3, where he blocks the e-pawn, and then his queen will be free for activities, for instance, to go to c1 and then a3, and create problems invading black's position. Meanwhile, the bishop on h2 prevents black from ever invading on h2 with his rooks. If he could achieve this, then indeed white would have every chance to hope for victory. But this is one of the problems also with being the favorite in a game of chess. This was too optimistic, and Fischer lost his objectivity playing against nominally weaker player. This move allowed black to play rook h1 and trade the two rooks for the white queen, which Fischer misevaluated the resulting position. So black played rook h1, which really was necessary. If king e3, white would be in control of the game. And here was the last chance for white to leave his disastrous course. He took on h1, which was a serious mistake. He had to play queen e3 and basically to give up the pawn on a4 after rook b1, bishop a4. And black is somewhat better here, but it's not at all clear, really. The position's still very blocked. It's still a very tough struggle. White will defend c2, and it's not very easy for black to make progress. But there was little chance that Fischer was going to do that. He was intent on winning this game. He played queen takes h1, winning the two rooks for the queen, but at the same time allowing black to activate his pieces, and in the resulting position the black pieces turn out to be better. So very important move that black interposed here, e3. It was much better than taking on h1, which would allow white to take back and then hopefully get the king to e3. If e3 here, then it's a different matter. I think here white can play king g1, and still it's a different position because rook is on h1, and compared to the game, white has better chances than in the game. Maybe black's even better there as well, but better move order was e3, forcing white to decide which way to go with the king. There's only one choice. The king had to go to g1, and then white will have to take with the rook with the king on h1. If king takes c3, then comes queen e4, and the king has to choose between f2 and c2, but they both lose, or d2 and f2, but they both lose. If king to d2, black would take h1, rook takes h1, queen takes f2, forking the king and bishop, and black wins. If, on the other hand, king f2, then black would take on h1, rook takes h1, bishop c6, hitting the pawn on g2, and after rook h2, queen takes c2 check, king g1 is the only move really, and queen takes c3, forking the rook on a1 and the bishop on g3. But the lack of this may seem random, but the lack of coordination makes this inevitable. The lack of coordination of the white pieces, like the Evans versus Rossolimo game earlier in the course, we see the two rooks end up in this situation being out of coordination, and the queen is dominant. Not always the case in every position, but in these kind of positions it turned out to be the case. The white couldn't take the pawn on e3. Also, if king e2, then black would take h1 and queen takes g2 and then win the bishop. So therefore, white had to play king g1. Now after rook h1, king h1, and now very strong e2. The pawn takes another step forward. This is better than bishop c6, which would allow white to create an effective blockade. Rook g1, and then if e2, rook e1. And the bishop on c6 is, while the may go there in some cases, it's going there so early is not good, because now, for instance, queen e4, white can play g6, and the position becomes much more unclear, because black has to retreat his bishop to stop the pawn. So first e2, the pawn becomes a danger to white, and here Fischer realized that he had gone wrong. He had already realized probably, and he started to take desperate measures with the creative move rook to b5. But this move was not enough to save him. However, his position was, after other moves, was also lost. For instance, if he tries to reach the same position as before after rook g1, here black would play queen e4 instead of moving the bishop to c6. And now the pawn on c2 is under attack, and also queen e3 is coming as well. So white's queenside pawns are falling. So for instance, rook a to e1, queen takes c2. Later, the a4 pawn will fall. Maybe the c3 pawn. White is losing here. His pieces are not working. Also, if rook to e1 immediately, then also queen e4, and the pawn on c2 is attacked. Queen e3 is coming, and bishop also later can enter the fray. So white's position is also very bad there. So Fischer tried this desperate move rook b5, hoping to transfer the rook to e5, and otherwise asking black to give up the bishop for the rook, and white's hoping that then the g-pawn will provide enough counterplay. Black took on b5, Hay takes b5, and then queen takes b5. Correctly, he takes this pawn, not afraid of white's g-pawn. If g6, then black can just go queen e8, and the pawn will be stopped. Also, if white takes the a-pawn, Then black has queen b1, king h2, and then he can queen this pawn, and white won't get anywhere with his g-pawn. The black queen will come back to stop it. So white played rook e1, preparing to take the e-pawn. Now a5. So black has taken the pawn and creates a new passed pawn. His e-pawn is lost, but the a-pawn is the new threat for white. Rook takes e2, a4. Not afraid again of g6. If g6, queen e8, and if g7, queen g6. And black will take the pawn. And then the a-pawn will run down the board. So white took on e6 first, a3, and now g6. If white played rook e5, hoping to first drive the black queen away, black could just take on e5. And then a2, and he queens with check, and his queen will get back in time to stop the g-pawn. So g6 white played, and here setting a trap, which of course Ullmann was attentive enough not to fall into. If he just routinely played a2, then g7, and after a1 check, king h2, and there's no way to stop the white pawn from queening, amazingly. Despite black's two queens, white pawn will queen with check, and then the game turns around. White will begin attacking black, and, well, who knows what's going on. So instead, just queen d7. The black queen comes back, the a-pawn will eventually queen, or if not, black will trade it for the white g-pawn. But the queen comes back to stop white's pawn, attacks the rook. White played rook e5, saving the rook. Of course, the rook was under attack. And now b6, simply stopping rook from coming to a5. White's idea was to bring the rook to a5 and try to take black's a-pawn while promoting white's g-pawn, keeping white's g-pawn. But Fischer was a tough fighter. Defeating him was not easy, but Ullmann was able to do it. Now bishop h4. White couldn't do much else. a2, rook a1. He stops the black pawn from queening, but now black simply trades the g-pawn for the a-pawn and reaches the home stretch. Queen g7, rook a1. White has no way to keep his pawn on g6, and with it his last hope. And now queen takes g6, and white resigned. So he can finally take white's a-pawn, the black a-pawn, but then, for instance, queen h5, g3, queen f3, king h2, queen takes c3, and black is easily winning this position. The d-pawn is under attack. If bishop f6, then b5, and black's just going to push his b-pawn, and finally he'll make a passed pawn that white won't be able to stop without losing the rook. So, very dramatic game, rather famous game, as were most of Fischer's losses, considering how rare they were. Also very instructive. White's plowed ahead with f4, but overlooked the subtle positional idea of black that equalized the game, and then finally over-optimistically pushed forward too much and took too many risks, and even overstepped the bounds of risk in his search for victory.